Happy St. Paddy's Day again, Whiskey Noobs. We had our whiskey review, our Irish whiskey review last week for St. Paddy's Day, and today we have a little bit of a treat. But before we get to that, my name is Chris, and you're listening to the Whiskey Noobs podcast, for those of you who are new here and don't know my name yet. Today we have a very special guest on the show for St. Paddy's Day. We have Darryl McNally from Limavady Irish Whiskey once again on the show, and he is going to walk us through some of the history of Irish whiskey. Now, I am recording this after the conversation is over, and let me tell you, we had a great conversation today. We get into all sorts of things. It's not just a history lesson, but I love the rich history that Irish whiskey has, which is why I wanted to have him on the show to discuss it. So much of it is influenced by wars and by the government, and it shaped the landscape of what we're seeing nowadays, and so I find that to be absolutely incredibly interesting. So Darryl helps walk us through that, since it is a history that he knows very well, and we talk about how it has affected the landscape of Irish whiskey today, how it's affected what we're seeing with different distillers and with his distillery Limavady, and it is a ton of fun. So I hope you guys enjoy the interview that I had with Darryl, but without further ado, let's get to it. I have here with me Darryl from Limavady. Some of you guys might remember him from episode 81. Darryl, it is great to have you back. How are you doing tonight?
Doing great, Chris. Great to be back on. We had some good fun the last night. We had some good Limavady whiskey. So looking forward to saying hello from Ireland, from Limavady here. I'm actually traveling to the US on Monday for up to 6 weeks, doing a bit of a trek across one side of the US and back then to Savannah for St. Patrick's Day. So looking forward to spending that in Savannah. But great to be on here to talk all things history of Irish whiskey and enjoy a little Irish whiskey, Limavady Irish whiskey with you as well. So, sláinte.
Yeah, cheers. That's awesome. When this comes out, you will be headed across the US then.
Yeah, so I essentially leave on Monday. So I go to New York for 3 nights. So I'm in New York from sort of 27th of February to 2nd of March. Then I'm over to Dallas. There's like a North Texas Irish society where I'm doing a masterclass at it. Then I have the US Sales Conference along with the Whistlepig team. Then I'm in Phoenix for the Arizona Cocktail Week. I'm a judge at it. And then I'm flying across to Savannah to celebrate St. Patrick's Day and to do the whole in-market visit to all the key places and all the key outlets for Limavady on and off trade. Then I hope to spend a few days just downtime in the US and eventually then make it over to Seattle for the Seattle Cocktail Week at the end of March into April, and then back home. So probably five weeks in total. So looking forward to it. Yeah.
Wow, that is great. Sounds like it's gonna be a good time. This will be airing right before St. Paddy's Day, I believe, the Sunday beforehand. So you'll be
Cool.
over here doing your tour, I suppose.
Absolutely celebrating probably in Savannah and also making sure that Limavady's getting the love it deserves in Georgia, which I know it is.
That's great, yeah, and that's why we've got you here. So for everybody listening, this should be coming out right before St. Paddy's Day. So I wanted to have our resident master distiller on so that we could talk a bit about the history of Irish whiskey, because there's a pretty rich history that I think leads into the state that Irish whiskey is in today. And speaking for myself and for most people I know a lot of us over here in the U.S. just don't really know don't know that whole
Sure.
history. So I think it'd be great to dive into it. Maybe the first bit that you can give me here is, and I feel like this is almost too rudimentary of a question, how do I properly pronounce what you just said? Slanta?
Sláinte. Sláinte.
Slancha.
Yeah. Yeah, it's spelt sort of like slanty almost. It's like slanty, but with the
Yeah,
Irish fada, it's sláinte, which is cheers or good luck.
Slancha. I've seen it
Sláinte.
typed out before, and I am so bad,
Uh,
especially with Scotch pronunciations, that I
sure.
stay away from anything with accent marks and things on it. So Slancha,
Yeah.
I learned something new
Sláinte, yeah.
already.
Yeah, and
That's
Limavady,
great.
a lot of people ask me what does Limavady stand for. So there's an Irish Gaelic version of Limavady, which is exactly how you spell it in the English version, which is Limavady, how we spell it on the glass and on the bottle. A lot of people say to me, "How am I pronouncing it right?" I says, "Don't worry about pronouncing it. Just make sure you drink it, When you drink it, you won't
Yeah.
care. You won't care how you pronounce it. I says whether you say Limavady, Limavady. I don't care. All of them are right. All versions are right.
I'm
So.
glad to hear that as somebody who struggles with pronunciations. And that has a special meaning behind it as well. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that's leap of the dog. And when we're talking about history today, Limavady is a really, really old whiskey dating back to 1750, which, as you can imagine, there's a few key dates in the US history, 1776, independence, etc. So you can imagine Limavady's way back 1750, which is what, 273 years old or something like that. So I am just but a keeper, I always say, because with history and heritage like that, it's an honor to take Limavady back and bring it back to the world. So yeah, lots of history there, which we'll get into a little bit later, and how Limavady sort of links back to the Irish history of making whiskey.
Yeah, that's great. So we can go ahead and get started with the Irish whiskey sort of history here.
Sure.
Um, and so one thing I did want to start with is whenever I was researching Irish whiskey back probably 2 years ago or so, prepping for the show, it seemed that folks thought Scotch was the first whiskey for a while. There was a record from, I want to say it was like in the 1490s. And
Yeah.
now it seems we know at least the first recorded whiskey was Irish whiskey. If I'm not mistaken, it was in about 1406. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but I thought that was
Yeah.
pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, the way I always tell people, everybody has their own versions of it, and I've worked for Bushmills, which the oldest licensed whiskey distillery in the world, um, and what I always said goes right back to about the sixth century, um, but going back even further, back to about 486 AD. I sound like a history teacher here. But back in 486 AD, the north of Ireland, where Limavady is and where Bushmills is, they actually owned, or the islands of Scotland before the Scotty come in, that was all owned by Ireland. So the Islay and Campbelltown and Isle of Skye were all, the big Scottish whiskey making areas in Scotland. That actually all became known as Dalriadan, and was actually ran by the North Irish King of Ireland. So all those little islands and all actually belonged to Ireland way back in 486 AD. So it became known as Dalriadan. So there would have been little boats moving across, comparing whiskies or whatever the amber nectar was or whatever the juice was of the day. But I always, when I went traveling, there was a story written in the Book of Leinster in 1176, and it said that Sir Robert Savage fortified his troops before they went into battle with an amber nectar. Now, I have no doubt whatsoever that that amber nectar was Irish whiskey, because there were so many illicit stills where they'd have made the spirit, if you like, and then started to store them in casks, which they would have found then there would have been maturation and so on and so forth. But it goes way back to the 6th century. They say that although Ireland was sort of owned that bit of Scotland, if you like, in the 6th century, it was monks who actually brought back the alembic drum from the Far East when they were out preaching Christianity and finding about Christianity. And what they did is they brought that back, which was for making perfumes. But the Irish, of course, being as resourceful as we are, we found another use for that still or alembic drum that they would have used at the time, and we were then used it to make or to distill spirits, distill cereals to make spirits. So yeah, we were pretty useful when it came to that. And then I believe with the history of Dalriad, and then that tradition of making spirit, if you like, went over into Scotland when the Scotch came in, and then it was only maybe 300 or 400 years later that they really started to store more and more whiskey, and the whole history then evolved from that. That's my understanding of it.
Wow, I had actually never heard that about the giving it to the troops, I believe you said. I didn't
Yeah,
know that story.
yeah.
That's
It's written.
amazing.
So it's actually written in the Book of Kells. So yeah, 1176. Robert Savage fortified his troops before they went into battle, and he found that the troops were a little bit more aggressive, if you like, with a little bit of amber nectar in them. So I'm not saying that whiskey makes you aggressive, but it maybe helps to bring out that fighting flair, if you want, or the fighting
Yeah,
Irish.
certainly
So
cuts down on the nerves, I suppose.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
That is great. And I think there might be some folks listening too and who might not know this because we talk so much about bourbon in the US that is where we credit whiskey too, is across the pond that it started over there, and then of course, I don't think a lot of people think about time in their mind enough to realize the U.S. is very young compared to over there.
Correct, correct. And what you would have had is, with you had the max, or the exodus of Irish people leaving Ireland and coming to the US. They would have brought all those traditions and all the potatoes and cabbage and all the things that the Irish are renowned for. And whiskey making was one of them. Yeah, so I have no doubt whatsoever that there would have been Irish people bringing the art of distillation across to the US, and they shared it with their Scottish cousins. Just where I actually am sitting here now, Chris, as the crow flies, it's only about 20 miles to Scotland or to Islay. So, it's a very short, probably boat journey, if you like, back in those early days where they would have shared how to make whiskey. But I always say the Irish taught the Scotch how to make whiskey. They just didn't show them everything because we triple distill and the Scotch mainly double distill. So we threw a couple of the pages away on the way over in the boat, sort of thing. I say
Yeah,
I say that tongue in cheek with my Scottish cousins. We have a laugh about it. But yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That's very funny. So it's more common. I just want to make sure I got that right. It's more common in Ireland the triple distill, which we see on a lot of
Correct.
our bottles, and in
Correct.
Scotland they just double distill.
Double distill, yeah, yeah,
I actually, I mean, I see it on bottles. I never put it together like that.
yeah. So when you do the double distillation, um, the strength goes up to about maybe say 140 proof or 70% alcohol. When you triple distill, it goes up to about 84%, which is about 168 or 170 proof. So we then water it back down again, but it's like with the triple distillation, you've just a different, slightly different mouthfeel, a little bit more, distilled, if you like, some more purities from the alcohol family. But again, it's just the style of Irish whiskey as opposed to the style of Scotch whiskey. And really, it's about the preference back in the day of the distiller of what he really liked, very much like preference of food today. So, yeah, and that's how then Irish became renowned for triple distillation and Scotch became renowned for double distillation. All very good whiskies, but just slightly different, which makes them just a little bit different. Because everybody says to me, especially in the US, the Scotch and Irish, are they in competition? Yeah, a little bit, but Irish is a different style to Scotch, so it's not brother and sister, it's cousins at best. I always say as a terminology to explain it.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a couple other things that Irish whiskey is renowned for, which is a couple of the terms I kind of wanted to preface all of this with for those listening. One of which being pot still, and then the single
Yeah,
version of that being single pot still. Can you break that down for those listening who don't know what that means?
sure. Well, in my opinion now, some people may differ in this, but what I believe is that malted barley would have been always used, in the process of making Irish whiskey. The reason for that is that the natural enzymes within malted barley helps break down the sugars during the mashing process, when the sugars that are used then to convert into alcohols at the fermentation stage. There was a tax put on malted barley by Her Majesty at the time, back in 1785. So, in a way of getting taxes for illicit stills who were making spirit but not paying the taxes, the British at that time actually went back and actually taxed the malted barley, because if the malted barley used to make the whiskey, if they taxed it, then it meant even the illicit stills would have had to have paid extra money for it. So then that's when single pot still come out. Single pot still, rather than the mash bill being 100% malted barley, they mixed some of the malted barley with unmalted barley. So it might have been 50% malted barley to get the enzyme to break down the sugars. But instead of using a mash bill of 100% malted barley, they would have used maybe unmalted cereal, maybe just normal barley or oats or wheat, in order to sort of stop having to pay so much tax to the government. And then this slightly lighter form of spirit became known as pot still or single pot still, which have been very much the backbone of Jameson and Middleton and Redbreast today, which, great whiskies, just a little bit different in the taste profile. But my understanding of it is that it was always malted barley, or Irish always would have started off with 100% malted barley, but then due to taxes and, you know how these wars start about money and whatnot, people in more the southern part of Ireland would have bulked out their mash bill with unmalted barley as opposed to 100% malted barley. And that's where pot still became another variant, if you like, of Irish whiskey. And then much later, I think it was in the 1850s, 1860s, there was Igneous Coffee designed the coffee still or continuous still where the grain whiskey came from. So then all of a sudden you had three styles of whiskey. You had the 100% malted barley, you had the 50% malted barley, 50% unmalted barley, which became known as pot still. And then you had grain, which to me then, was the sort of bulking out agent, if you like, for blended whiskies, which became, very, very popular probably after the First World War and when Scotland adopted the coffee continuous still distillation process, the Irish were reluctant, very much reluctant at the start, and only adopted it much, much later. But it was an Irishman called Igneous Coffee, excise man from Ireland, who actually designed the coffee still and brought that other category of grain whiskey as we know today into use. And that's what we have today. But we also have a renaissance of some like double distilled Irish whiskey, double distilled peated Irish whiskey, double distilled, triple distilled peated Irish whiskey. So there's lots of different variants now as the world evolves and as innovation starts to take part. But that historically only had them three types right up to the early 1900s.
Wow. Okay. And I like that. I like that we're already talking about how the government influenced it with their taxes. 'Cause I think that's going to be a theme throughout.
Oh yeah. Oh
what
yeah.
we discuss.
Yeah.
That seems to always be the case. And so, when it's not single pot still, we have what Limavady is, which would be
Correct.
single malt, and it's all
Correct.
malted barley.
100% malted barley, yeah, in the mash bill.
Okay. Yeah, and then
Yeah.
for those listening who may not know what malting means, let me give my elementary version of it, and maybe you can tell me
Sure.
if I'm wrong or not.
Yeah.
Essentially, you are convincing the grain to want to sprout and then stopping it and drying it out, and that is going to convert the starches to sugars, I believe. Is that correct?
The starches are sugar. So the best way I explain it is that if you industrially trick the little barley corn into thinking that it's in the ground and about to grow into a plant. So you imagine the barley corn like this, and you put in the water, you're steeping it in water, so it's growing and growing and growing. And what it's doing is it's creating its starches or sugar build up in order for it to grow into a plant. But what you do, just as it kicks out its little acrospire, to grow, you dry it, locking in those sugars or starches. And then when you crush the barley, then that's the malting process. Therefore, you have a much sweeter barley corn with more sugars in it to create all those lovely tastes that you get when you convert the sugars into alcohol. Then when you mill that barley corn or malted barley, you want to get in at the sugars, and the sugars are really, really tightly packed sugars. So the natural enzymes within the malted barley, when you put different temperatures of water, it'll break down the really tightly packed sugars into simple sugars. The simple sugars will dissolve in the warm water, and it'll actually be drained down through the bed of the mash tun. And it's that sugary liquid known as worts that you then add the yeast to convert into alcohol, giving off an exothermic reaction of heat. Now, therefore, you know that the fermentation process is taking place, where when there's oxygen present, the yeast will grow. When the yeast grows and it turns into no oxygen left, it feeds in the simple sugars and converts the simple sugars into alcohol as a byproduct. So it's almost a byproduct. You get the lovely alcohol or ethanol as part of the process of fermentation. And then after that, it's a process of distillation, taking out the water to make the strength of the spirit that bit higher, and then into the casks for whatever number of years to give it that taste profile. And then you have Limavady to enjoy.
And that you mentioned the barley enzymes are really great at getting that sugar out of there, and that would be why even in our bourbons where corn is king, a lot of times we'll have some malted barley in there to help have the enzymes to help kickstart that chemical reaction.
Correct. Yeah.
So we get the best byproduct known to whiskey lovers, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I always have some fun as well because in the distillery, another byproduct of converting those sugars into alcohol is CO2. And CO2 is like been hit with pepper spray. So you open the fermentation vessels and you get somebody who you're maybe not so fond of. You get them to put their head in to have a little smell, and you can see them coming back very quickly. It's quite dangerous, but it's quite fun when there's somebody maybe not listening when you're trying to explain it. So you just go, here, do you want to have a nice smell of that lovely beer in there? The wash. You see them putting their head in. Next thing they're bounced back with tears stripping down the little bit of hit of CO2. So just one of those fun things us master distillers still enjoy to this day.
I'm glad you told me that. If I ever visit one, I will be certain not to stick my head in the mash tun.
Let somebody else do it first.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we've kind of laid out those terms, I do want to talk about the history of Irish whiskey because
Sure.
there's some pretty eventful things that happened that I think really impact the landscape we have now. So my understanding, and this is what you're here to help break down, since I just get the watered down version that we receive, is that at a certain point, multiple distilleries came together and kind of merged into Irish distillers due to economic things that were going on that we can talk about. So prior to that happening, what did the landscape of Irish whiskey look like? Did it look similar to what we have today, or was it drastically different?
Yeah, so going back to, the 1750s for Limavady and the 1608, we'll start at the history. So the 1608 at Bushmills, when I worked at Bushmills, we always traveled the world and told the story about, the oldest licensed distillery in the world. The license was granted to an area known as the Route, Rowte, but it's the old spelling of route as an Route, like Route 66. And it was across the north coast of Ireland at the time, where Limavady was actually part of it. But the license was granted to a Sir Thomas Phillips because of a lot of work that he did, helping the King of England, the King of Ireland at that time. And he was granted lands and granted the first official license to distill in 1608. Now, he lived in Limavady, which was quite interesting, and his daughter or his granddaughter was involved in the first distillery that was ever built in Limavady in 1750. But that area, Bushmills claims the title of the world's oldest, and I'm not going to argue with that. It is, and there's a history and all for it there. All I'm saying is that I know Limavady was in that area known as the Route. I know that Limavady is really old as a comparison, because one of the really old distilleries that we always quote is Kilbeggan Distillery, which was formed in 1757, sort of 7 years after Limavady. And then you have Jameson, or Irish Distillers, Jameson as we know. Jameson was formed in 1780 in Bow Street in Dublin. So then it's all those distilleries were sort of formed around around that time. But there was dark days of Irish whiskey, and that wasn't that long ago. It was sort of the early 1900s, where we had the First World War. We had the Irish Civil War, where essentially, the British put an embargo on exports of Irish whiskey. So that pretty much near killed the Irish whiskey world, because back then, Scotch whiskey did about 14 million cases. Irish whiskey did about 14 million cases. Then, with the Prohibition, with the Irish Civil War, and with the First World War, the sales of Irish pretty much fell through the floor, which was sad days for that. Irish whiskey now, as in this year or last year, we've only hit 14 million cases again, which is quite amazing. So that's the demise of Irish whiskey in the 19th century, early 19th century. So we're only rightly getting back, because there was something like 102 distilleries in Ireland producing them 14 million cases, which was, same as Scotland. Scottish now is 95 or 96 million cases. So they got a chance to move on. Irish was pretty much in a bad way then. So I remember starting with Irish Distillers back in 1998, and even as recent as 25 years ago, it sounds a long time now, but I remember it as if it was yesterday. There was dark days of Irish whiskey then, so they did have to all pull together to try and keep the economies of scale, to keep the brands, and to keep the Irish category alive. Today, thank God, it's a different story, and Irish whiskey's booming, and we're getting back up. We've down from 102 distilleries to essentially Middleton Distillery in County Cork, down in Middleton, and you had Bushmills up in County Antrim, almost as north as you go and south as you can go. That was it. There was only those two distilleries until Cooley Distillery opened in 1987, I believe. And then the Renaissance, then in the last maybe 7 or 8 years, has brought the number of distilleries back up to, I think there's about 47 or 48 built or planned to be built in Ireland now. So we're slowly getting back to where we rightfully belong. But you're quite right. It was the Irish distillers and grouping together and economies of scale that probably saved Irish whiskey from an historic point of view. And look at where we are today, which is amazing. It just keeps growing, and we're showing 20% growth a year, which is fantastic for all the Irish whiskey brands out there. And I always say to people, it's time for the Irish whiskey now to shine again. And I think that's becoming so apparent, especially in the US, which is great. Great for me, great for everybody in the industry, and great for Limavady, which it's fun times.
Yeah, and I mean, when you put that in perspective a little bit, that it was 14 million and we're just getting back to 14 million, and you think
Correct.
about back then, I mean, over the course of the past maybe decade, 2 decades, bourbon has exploded.
Yeah.
So back then, you were way less saturated with bourbon, and you were even with Scotch. And so now we're just getting back to that volume. But
Mhm.
in terms of volume, we're back to that volume. But if in terms of how many Irish bottles were on a shelf next to the bourbon shelf, it's miraculous to think about how that, like we mentioned, the governments and the economies and the wars had such a profound impact.
Absolutely, and that's why we now have the Irish Whiskey Association, and we have teams of everybody that represents their brands, etc. And we just make sure that nobody's going to come in and create whiskies that's not going to tick the box for whiskey, or people maybe not making whiskey the way they should. We have a technical file, we have a governance, if you like, to work to, with people who want to protect, if you like, the Irish whiskey category, and that's so important that we don't fall back into any opportunity for it to go through the floor again. That's not what we want, and it's great because, especially in the US, I always laugh. There's about 6.5, 7 million people in Ireland, but if you asked how many people in America are Irish, there's about 70 million, which is again due to all the movements back in the day of people going to make their fortunes in the US, or indeed in the darker days during the famine when people had to move to the US just to to create a world for themselves and create a life for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite common to have Irish heritage over here. I know my wife's whole side of her family is proudly Irish.
Good,
So
good.
yeah,
Uh-huh,
yeah,
uh-huh.
it's very common over here. Um, then when you mentioned that it shut down to Irish distillers and Bushmills, is that like all there was at the time? Is it was just those two
Yeah.
conglomerates, Bushmills, and then the kind of the conglomerate that is Irish distillers?
No, well, Bushmills was actually part of Irish Distillers. So there was
Oh,
Irish
okay.
Distillers. So there was, the Jameson, the Paddy, the Powers, all the Dublin, if you like, and Cork distilleries would have amalgamated. I think it was the mid '60s, maybe 1966, '67, something like that. But Bushmills actually joined Irish Distillers as well. Then I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was the early '80s, early to mid '80s. So when I joined Bushmills in 1998. I joined Irish Distillers, so we were all a monopoly, if you like, on Irish whiskey. It wasn't until 2005 that Diageo actually bought Bushmills, because I was still working at Bushmills. I remember it as if it was yesterday, and that was the first breakaway of a brand or a production site, if you like, away from a monopoly of Irish whiskey, which is and was Irish Distillers. So that was the first breakaway was Bushmills, and it was easy for Bushmills to break away because Middleton would have produced most of the whiskey for all the Jameson, Paddy, Powers, all the Southern Irish whiskies, and it was all very much the pot still style and grain style.
Hmm.
So Bushmills, because it was a site on its own up north, it was easy to sort of subtract it from the family, if you like. So here was me working with colleagues from Irish Distillers day and daily, and I'm still friends with a lot of them even today. And we're pulled out of the family and sold to Diageo then in 2005. So yeah, I remember the days of being part of Irish Distillers, Jameson, so on and so forth. And I also then remember the movement in 2005 to Diageo. And then it's when Cuervo bought Bushmills in 2015. That's when the whole Irish whiskey world was on fire at that time. And I was being called, can you design me a distillery? Can you come and design brands? So I, with a very heavy heart, and I mean a heavy heart, left Bushmills, and it was actually 1st of April 2015, so it was April Fool's Day 2015. So there you go. And I left in 2015 and went then to look about creating other brands for other people and so on and so forth. But eventually I came back to Limavady because I knew I knew what I wanted to do, and I wanted to bring Limavady back to life. And we spoke about this before because one is a really old brand, 1750, but my family owned it in 1880 and only owned it for a few years as well because that was probably the start of the dark days when actually Scottish distilleries were beginning to buy up Irish distilleries and closing them down. So there's another little bit of history that I didn't even think about mentioning. And Limavady was actually bought in 1912 and closed down. And it closed in 1912, and it was closed down by apparently Scottish or British owners who more or less closed down the competition. But again, it probably wasn't economical to keep them open with all the different embargoes and on shipping to the US and all the dark days that we talked about earlier. So yeah, sad days for a lot of the old brands back in that sort of early 1900s. But we're back.
Wow.
We're back now in
Yeah.
the 2020s, and yeah, hopefully be here for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is so it shut down to Bushmills and Irish Distillers came together, split back
Hmm.
apart a bit. And
Yeah,
so for a very long time, they were the only ones producing new make, like new distillate off of stills.
correct.
And that is kind of part of, I know this is also very popular in Scotland, but this is something I constantly try to tell people who talk about sourced bourbon is that
Mhm.
sourced whiskey in Scotland and in Ireland is very common. Working on just blending or picking the proper sourcing and doing the proper finishing, correct?
Yeah, a lot of there was only three distilleries. There was, as I say, Middleton in County Cork. There was Bushmills in County Antrim. The third distillery was Cooley Distillery in County Louth, which is sort of halfway house, if you like, just north of Dublin. It opened, I think, or it was an old potato plant, a potato petrochemical plant that was created, to create fuels, and it was converted to a distillery, I think, in 1987. So John Teelan and a group of his colleagues actually opened Cooley Distillery in 1987, and then they sold it to Beam Suntory. God, I don't know, many years ago. That it must be nearly, would it be 8 or 10 years now? They sold it to Beam Suntory. So that really was only the three distilleries in Ireland actually producing new make, which sourced whiskey, the whiskey had to be sourced from one of those three distilleries to create a lot of the brands that we have today. A lot of the new Irish whiskey brands, it's sourced whiskey with a different slant to it. But what it did do is it allows you to get your brand out there and then build your distillery to become the home then of the brand that you're creating. So there's two or three ways that you could do it. You build a distillery and you wait for 5 years to have liquid and then you create a brand. Or you source some whiskey, which is, there's a lot of sourcing in the US, there's a lot of sourcing in Scotland for years. Ireland with all the new brands, there has to be a little bit of sourcing. I'm not against that at all as a distiller because I was one of three master distillers running Bushmills back in the day. But I'm happy that the Irish whiskey category with all the brands is growing and growing now, and we're creating our own history, if you like. And then the distilleries have been built in the back of that as the consumer enjoys the Irish whiskey and the style of Irish whiskey, and then the whole thing will move forward sort of every 3, 4, 5 years as more and more distilleries become online, and more importantly, they create their new make, and their new make whiskey comes online then 4 or 5 years later, and that it's lovely to see. To be honest, it makes you proud to be an Irishman and proud to be in the Irish whiskey world.
Yeah, and I think that's something that gets so often overlooked. We don't even think about that we're drinking a 5 or a 12 or a 21-year whiskey. That means that if a distillery opens today, they're not selling anything of their own, like that they distilled, for 5 more
Correct.
years.
Well, some people they might launch, but I always say with a malt, you wouldn't launch a malt unless it's sort of 5, 6, 7 years. So with some malt distilleries, it might even be longer. Like Limavady is about 5 years in total. So again, when I my Limavady distillery built, I'm producing it'll take 5 years, so I'll need to rely on source liquid. The difference being that I take the source liquid and do something different. What we do the PX finish, and you create the recipes, if you like, to create for a taste profile that I feel is it ticks the boxes for me, but hopefully it ticks the boxes for those new consumers coming through, and younger whiskey drinkers coming through. They expect something a little bit more fiery. Limivady's got that 92 proof, but a little bit then of the PX finish, which is just not maybe a generic sort of bourbon spice vanilla. It's got the spice and vanilla, of course, but then it's got that lovely PX at the end, which gives a sweetness, which is great. It's won a few awards even since we last spoke, which is great. So you keep the awards coming. We're doing something right.
That's great. Yeah, it seems to be the case. I think I saw you on Whiskey Advocate, right? This year it was, what was it, 8 or 6? I
Eight,
recall.
eight,
Eight.
number eight, yeah, yeah, which is
That's
great. Like,
fantastic.
yeah, to be not in the top 20 whiskies for Whiskey Advocate for 2022. Consider me only launched late 2021. It was like the end of August 21. That I'll take that all day long. It made my Christmas. Put it like that. It made my Christmas and New Year.
I bet it did. Yeah, that was great to see. I saw that after, of course, we had done our episode, and I thought that is
Yeah.
fantastic for such a young brand to already be on that list. That's great.
I looked at, I think the Irish, I think Redbreast was got a, above me there was a Redbreast and there was a Middleton. So I just went, whoa, I'm in good keeping, with Middleton whiskey and with Redbreast, two really good Irish whiskies. I go, I'll take that all day long. And I think some of the team at Whistle Pig says, so are you going for top five next year? And I go, oh God, please help, help. Yeah, let's hope. But again, that does no harm for, people in the holiday season to actually come and try Limavady. And that's what it's all about. Try Limavady and I know you'll enjoy it. It's just a case of enjoying the history that we're talking about tonight, but also then taste the liquid and hopefully you'll be like the Whiskey Advocate and give it the thumbs up.
Yeah, absolutely. Enjoy the rich whiskey with the rich history that we're discussing.
Very good. I like that.
Absolutely.
I like that. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that
There
for
you
sure.
go. I have a little branding spot for you. There you
hmm
go.
hmm
um, so now that we've come out of the I guess the dark times as you mentioned, and so
Yeah.
now we've got all these distilleries springing forward. I One thing that I was very surprised by when I was looking into it was the number of brands that still come out of Middleton that I don't think a lot of people realize. I think in our heads we're picturing you've got Jameson kind of over here, and then you've got Powers kind of over here.
Yeah.
Are there a few other big ones that you would mention that maybe somebody like myself wouldn't even realize all come from Middleton there?
Yeah, well, there was, as I say, all of them came from Middleton or from Irish distillers before Bushmills sort of broke off, as part of the Irish distillers team. One of the big things is uh, what I like about Irish whiskey now. Some of the big names in drinks world, if you like, the Sazeracs of the world, for example. Sazerac, they bought Paddy, a few years back from Irish distillers, so that was removing Paddy from the Irish distillers family. So it sort of broke up a little bit. It's concentrating very much on its Jameson, which is the entry level blended whiskey. You can't argue with Jameson. It's selling, I think, 12 million cases worldwide. It's a great whiskey in the US for shooting beer, so on and so forth. You have different varieties of Jameson. You then have Redbreast, which is sort of that aged, finished in casks, which is a great whiskey. And then you have the Middleton family, which will always, the Middleton high end whiskies. That's sort of the three main brands that Irish distillers are concentrating. And Powers, of course. Powers there, did you see the logo the other day? They brought out a rye, an Irish rye. And the logo for Powers was Bye Bye American Rye. And I went, oh my God, that's crazy. Like, that's again an Irish taking a very much an American rye whiskey and then on the billboards, Bye Bye American Rye. And I thought, no, that's not going to happen. It's
I
not going to
hadn't
happen.
seen that, but
Yeah. But
here's
again,
what I'll give them. I'll give them for the branding. I'm curious now.
yeah, yeah. It was something I seen popped up on, I think it was the Irish whiskey fans in America or something. So I just went, oh my God, that's advertising to the nth degree. And, I can't say too much because Whistle Pigs, very much my family, with the rye whiskey, they own that space in my opinion. But hey, if there's Irish
Yeah.
rye coming in, so be it. It's an Irish, it's not an American rye. So just look that up. It's quite funny. But then
I
you have Paddy then that's now part of the Sazerac family. You have Bushmills as part of the Cuervo family. You'll have some more of the bigger players coming in for some of these smaller Irish whiskey brands. Even with Whistlepig coming, and partnering with me with Limavady, that was great, because that was early days. It's really helped me. We're in 32 states now in the US, which is amazing. Like considering we only launched August 2021. The amount of people within the industry come up to me and go, "Oh my God, I'm traveling the US and Limavady is everywhere. How did you do that?" And I says, "Well, that's over to my Whistlepig family helping out, and the way we've everything set up." So I always say you can't get people to taste Limavady whiskey if it's not in the shelves or if it's not in the bars. So the only way to do it is to get that distribution and good distribution, and then I'm looking forward now to go back into the US next week to see all the good work that we did last year and see what sort of pull through we had with Limavady. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Now, now that we've come out of that dark time and we've got so many
Mhm.
distilleries, we've talked. You just mentioned the Bye Bye American Rye. What sort of changes in the landscape are you seeing, especially since you're right in the thick of it right now, as you're having that boom, that 20% growth you talked about? Are you
Sure.
seeing big changes in the landscape over there?
Absolutely. You had the old traditional whiskey, which sadly sometimes it was sort of like an old man's drink and not male female, not the younger generation, and not the younger generation male female. I think Irish whiskey has opened up to the younger generation, to males and females to enjoy whiskey together. I think Irish whiskey lends itself to that. I've seen an Irish whiskey innovation, finishing in beer casks, doing the rye, for example, doing Limavady's single barrel PX finish. There was never young malt finished in a PX and bottled individually. And that was one of the interviews with Whiskey Advocate. The gentleman said to me, he says, "But are you sure it's the only single barrel?" And I go, "Yeah, it is." So he went and Googled it that night and he messaged me back. He goes, "You're right. I went looking for another Irish." But again, that was something that I just, from an innovation point of view, The Pedro Jimenez casks were slightly different. There was slightly more spice maybe in some of the casks, but if you bottled the casks individually, each bottle or each cask number on your Limavady bottle could be slightly different, which to me just adds to the fun and the complexity of the whole maturing process. But again, it's something quite fun for the younger generation coming through. So there's innovation on cask types, there's playing about with different mixes, there's sticking with tradition, and then there's other brands like the Dead Rabbit, which is the story of the Irish after the uh, after the famine going across to the US, and there was a Dead Rabbit gang who spoke in their Irish native tongues, and the Diad the Beats, which was Irish Gaelic, which is big fight strong, strong fighting Irishman, and the locals who spoke English went, "What is them crazy Irish guys been on about dead rabbits for?" And the Dead Rabbit gang, so there's that sort of no history or no heritage or not the name of a place brands coming out too, which again I think just adds to the whole Irish category and just gives it that lift. So it isn't the sort of, how would you say, shirt and tie and suits and meal only and older meal drinking, which would have been maybe the 1950s, 1960s view on it. Today's a modern world where everybody's enjoying Irish whiskey, and thank God Irish whiskey, it's quite easy to taste if you like. So it opens up the doors for a lot of people who maybe wouldn't want a harsher taste and drink, or maybe too smoky Scotch. Some of the smoky Scotch maybe wouldn't want that. So I think it just is that nice halfway house to drink a liquid that's quality, that's made with precision, that takes time to make, and just oozes quality. That that generation that are coming up want to know how it's made, where it was made, what ingredients was used, sustainability, innovation, all those good things. And I think that's what the Irish whiskey category brings, and that's why it's grown by 20%. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right. It's funny that you say that. I didn't even plan to mention this, but you're absolutely right about it being such a good introductory whiskey. In multiple videos, maybe even on the show, I've always liked to recommend Tullamore Dew, just their base whiskey, for somebody who's trying it and just thinks even some scotches are a bit too harsh. Not necessarily a smoky scotch, but just even then they're a bit too harsh, because I find that Irish whiskey can be so easy to drink if you haven't drank whiskey before.
Yeah, and that's sort of the Jameson world as well. Where people, the younger generation would have shot Jameson because it's easy. Jameson's pot still in grain, but it's it does exactly what it says in the tin. And as I say, you can't argue with Jameson and how well it's done over the years. And now that you know it, I used to be part of Irish Distillers and Jameson, so like you never hear me saying a bad word about anything, because you can't argue with the quality of the liquid, and indeed out in the
Hey,
many
and if
case
that's
sales.
how they're hooking people in to make them want to try the little bit more complex stuff,
Yeah, and what
there
I
you
what I
go.
love is because the more people who drink Jameson or drink Irish whiskey have more chance then to maybe try Limavady, and it just helps everybody and raises the profile of the category. And I always say, okay, there's competition. Of course, there's competition between brands, but if somebody gets converted into Irish whiskey style, then they're going to try various different styles or brands of Irish whiskey. So therefore, it's good for everybody, and there's a little bit of the pie for everybody, which I think is the best way to look at it.
Yes, you're in a very great moment of growth for the whiskey industry that I always mention to my friends that are also on TikTok and on Instagram, because we're also competing with each other, and I
Yeah,
always say we're in a moment right now where we get to work together, because as we work together, this whole thing grows. And it's great for all of us. Like you said, we all get a piece of the pie with the whole
exactly.
whiskey industry right now.
Correct. Yeah, and it's so nice and refreshing. Okay, gin has its day sometimes, and vodka has its day. But whiskey tends to keep the test of time, or stand the test of time, if you like. There's more and more people now moving to brown spirits and quality brown spirits, and yeah, it's just a great time to be in the industry, and a great time to be in whiskey.
That it is. And I think that is a great spot for us to close on there. So
Uh,
as we're rounding out here, great time to be an Irish whiskey. Is there anything coming up for Limavady? I know you mentioned you're coming over here that you
yeah.
want to mention, or anything you'd like to talk about?
No, as I say, we're in 32 states now, so we're in all the states. The states that we're not in is the control states, which we're working on. They're just a little bit harder to get into. But as I say, that the hard work was done last year to go out and travel around the state. So it's in most places, so people can get it in their local bars and their off licenses, etc. I'm looking forward to getting into the US. Looking forward to getting to Savannah and spending another St. Patrick's Day in Savannah. I was blown away last year. about the size of the parade, and I think Savannah's third. I think second only to New York and Chicago. So yeah, looking forward to get over there and preaching more about Limavady and raising a toast on St. Patrick's Day to Limavady in the year ahead. Yeah.
Absolutely. We love our St. Patty's Day over here. As you mentioned, we have a large density of Irish folks over here, so we love our St. Patty's Day.
No, absolutely. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's great. So if you don't mind my asking, I have a couple of a little bit more fun questions that
Sure,
I'd like to mention. I have some patrons now, so I'd like to make a little bit of extra content for them that I think could be a little bit fun.
sure.
So these last couple of questions for Darryl will be edited with video and posted to the Whiskey Noobs Patreon. So go to patreon.com/Whiskey Noobs or check out the link in the show notes to check it out. Darryl, it is always fun having you on. I feel like every time I leave, having learned so much, I got to go write it down or something. You're so knowledgeable on the topic. It's great to hear. I know my listeners like that sort of content, and for me, I'm a whiskey nerd. I love hearing about all this. So thank you so
Oh,
much.
you're welcome. You're welcome. It's great. It's great. And we must meet sometime when I'm in the US. We have to meet up and have a dram and a good chat off the air and enjoy a few
Yeah,
whiskeys.
absolutely. It's on my bucket list to get over to Ireland sometime, so I'll make sure
Absolutely.
I say something.
Keep in touch, and we'll definitely meet up in Ireland. That would be even better. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Uh,
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on. And I'm looking forward to. I'll keep an eye out for Whiskey Advocate this year. I'm looking forward to see what the future has in store for you.
Fingers crossed. Thanks.
Fingers crossed for you. Thanks, Darryl. I'll talk to you later.
All the best. Bye bye.
Before we round out this episode, we do have a new $10 patron to shout out. So if you join the $10 tier of my Patreon, you do get a shout out at the end of an episode. And so today I would like to shout out Mark Porter. Mark, I appreciate the heck out of it. I appreciate all of my patrons, all of my followers, anybody who has ever watched or liked a post of mine. But I'm definitely grateful for you, Mark, and for the other patrons. So thank you so much for joining the Patreon. For those of you who are interested, you can find that at the link in the show notes or at patreon.com/Whiskey Noobs. Thank you for listening to this episode of Whiskey Noobs. If you like the show, please make sure to leave a 5-star rating or review to help grow the show and get the word out. You can also find more Whiskey Noobs content on Instagram at whiskey_noobs and on TikTok at Whiskey Noobs Podcast. If you want to drink right along with me, make sure to join the email list by sending an email to whiskeynoobspodcast@gmail.com with a subject line saying email list. You will receive monthly emails with a list of the whiskeys that will be featured throughout the month so that you can buy them ahead of time and drink right along with the show. Once again, thanks for listening to this episode. The Whiskey Noobs Podcast does not support underage or otherwise irresponsible consumption of alcohol.